The steam does not smell like anything you know. It smells like the ground itself has opened its mouth. Sulfur, wet stone, something older than language. A man is standing at the edge of a bubbling pool. He is not afraid. He has been coming here since he was a boy. His grandfather came here. His grandfather's grandfather came here. They have a word for this place, and it is not a word of fear. It is a word for something the world does through this ground. Something breathing. He watches the surface tremble. He waits. He listens to the water gather itself somewhere below the earth, deep in a chamber no eye has ever seen. And then, when the release comes, when the steam roars upward into the freezing morning, he does not flinch. He knows what is underneath. And 900 miles east of here, in a country that will one day be called Ohio, a man is being buried with a spear point cut from a piece of black volcanic glass, quarried within sight of where this man is now standing. That is what is beneath Yellowstone. That is what the Shoshone always knew, and it is the story almost no one bothered to tell. Let me begin somewhere quieter. Let me begin with a place, and a people, and a word. The people call themselves New. It means simply the people. English speakers know them as Shoshone, sometimes as Snake Indians, a name they never chose for themselves, a name given to them by others, a name that traveled onto maps and stuck. Their language is Numic, one branch of a larger family that stretches from the Great Basin all the way south into what is now Mexico, into the country of the Comanche, into the country of the Aztec. They are, in a linguistic sense, an ancient road that runs across half a continent. By the year 1600, long before any Europeans set foot in the country we now call Wyoming, the Shoshone had already been living in the high country of the Rockies for centuries. Some say 1,000 years. Some say 12,000. The archaeology at Yellowstone Lake, at Obsidian Cliff, in the Wind River Range, keeps pushing that number backward. Every survey turns up something older. Every wildfire that burns through the park lays bare another campsite. There are, at last count, more than 1,900 documented archaeological sites inside Yellowstone National Park. Only about 3% of the park has ever been surveyed. If you multiply that out, honestly, the numbers begin to hurt the head. The Shoshone were not a single group. They were many. Bands took their names from what they ate. There were the Agadika, the salmon eaters, along the rivers of Idaho. There were the Kukundika, the buffalo eaters, out on the eastern plains. There were the Penguidika, the fish eaters. There were the Yampadika, who dug for the Yampa root. And in the highest country of all, in the mountains at the heart of what would become the world's first national park, there was a band called the Tukudika. It is pronounced Tukudika. It means, in their own language, eaters of the meat, eaters of the mountain sheep, the bighorn. For centuries, these were the people of Yellowstone, not seasonal visitors, not passing through, residents, year-round. The bighorn sheep did not migrate very far because they did not need to, and the Tukudika followed the sheep. They wintered in the sheltered basins at the edges of the plateau. They summered high, up where the ram herds grazed the alpine meadows. Their homes were structures called wickiups, cone-shaped shelters built of fallen conifer poles, sometimes lined with bark, sometimes plastered with mud. In the coldest months, they moved into caves in the volcanic cliffs. They did not use horses. This was later held against them by the Anglo-American observers who came to write about them, who assumed a people without horses must be a poorer people, a weaker people. This was a projection. The Tukudika did not need horses. Horses cannot climb the shale slopes where the bighorn feed. Dogs can. And so the Tukudika kept large packs of dogs that carried their belongings on small travois, dogs that helped in the hunt. And with those dogs, they moved through country that no man on a horse could enter. Their bows were legendary. This is not romanticism. This is documented. Every mountain man who wrote about them said the same thing. The Tukudika took the horns of bighorn rams, and they soaked those horns in the hot springs of Yellowstone until the horn became pliable, until it could be worked and reshaped and laminated with sinew from elk and deer. The result was a compound bow only about 3 feet long, so powerful and so accurate that other tribes traded whole horses for a single one of them. In the year 1834, a fur trapper named Osborne Russell walked into a valley in what is now the Yellowstone Lamar country and found a small band of Tukudika living there. 6 men, 7 women, 8 or 10 children. He wrote in his journal that they were, in his words, neatly clothed in dressed deer and sheep skins of the best quality, perfectly contented and happy. He noted their bows. He noted that they had obsidian tips on their arrows. He noted that they had beaver skins they had ruined by burning off the fur, because they did not know these skins had value to the white world. Think about that last detail for a moment. In 1834, in the heart of the Rocky Mountains, there was still a small band of Shoshone who had never traded a beaver pelt, who did not know what a beaver pelt was worth, who knew only that it was meat. That is how deep in their own world they were. And the obsidian on those arrow points, the black glass tipping every arrow and every quiver, came from a cliff that these same people, or the ancestors of these same people, had been mining for 11,000 years. Obsidian Cliff sits in the northwestern corner of Yellowstone National Park, a wall of dark volcanic glass about 150 feet high and half a mile long. It is one of the great quarries of North America. The glass was formed by a lava flow 180,000 years ago, and for as long as human beings have been in this country, they have been coming to this cliff to break off pieces of it, to nap those pieces into blades and spear points, and to carry those blades away. Some of those blades have been found in Wisconsin, some in Ohio, some in Ontario, some as far east as Maine. One archaeological cache in a Hopewell burial mound in Ohio contained 660 pounds of raw Yellowstone obsidian. 660 pounds. Carried in an age before wheels, before horses, across 2,000 miles. Ask yourself, and be honest, what does it take to make people carry 660 pounds of stone 2,000 miles? It takes a place that matters. It takes a place that is known. It takes a place that is on the map of the mind for peoples across half a continent. And that is what Yellowstone was. It had names in many languages. The Crow called the geyser country Baid Mape, sacred or powerful water. The Blackfeet called it many smoke. The Flatheads, in their own tongue, called it smoke from the ground. The Kiowa called one particular pool Tung Sa Uda, which means, in their language, the place of hot water. The Shoshone and their Bannock relatives had their own name, sometimes rendered as the land of the burning ground, sometimes as the land of vapors. None of these names meant hell. None of them meant fear. They meant, quite simply, this is the place where the ground breathes. Because the Shoshone knew what was underneath. They knew that something down there, in the darkness, was alive. Not alive in the way you might tell a child a bedtime story. Alive in the way a river is alive. In the way weather is alive. A system, a force, a set of behaviors that a hunter can learn to read the way he learns to read the tracks of a deer. Here is what they knew, without any of the science we now have. They knew the ground was hot in certain places, and that the water in those places would soften a sheep horn until it could be bent. That is a metallurgical fact. It is also a piece of knowledge that took someone, somewhere, at some point, thousands of years ago, the courage to test. They knew that certain pools were safe to bathe in, that certain waters could ease sore joints and heal wounds. In the words of one Crow medicine man remembered by anthropologists, the springs held benevolent spirits, spirits who could help the sick. The Crow told of a healer known as the Fringe, who would immerse his patients in the warm water beside him. They knew that the earth in these places sometimes shook, that the ground would tremble underfoot when a geyser was about to erupt. They read those tremors. They took shelter, or they moved, or they simply waited, the way one waits for a summer storm. They knew that steam vents opened and closed, that new pools appeared where there had been dry ground the year before. That old pool sometimes went silent forever. The landscape was not static in their memory. It was in motion, and they knew it was in motion. And they knew where the water was going and where it came from because they had a story about it. The story is old. It is documented in the Shoshone tradition, in the version passed down through a family called Dixie, and it was written down in the middle of the 20th century by a folklorist named Ella Clark. It goes something like this. Coyote, who was in Shoshone tradition the trickster and sometimes the fool, came walking through the country one day, hungry. He came upon an old woman who was Mother Earth in the shape of a woman, and beside her sat a basket of fish, cooking. Coyote asked her to share her food. She said yes, but told him he must not touch the basket. She turned her back. Coyote, being Coyote, could not help himself. He knocked over the basket. The fish spilled out. The water in the basket, the water she'd been using to cook, poured across the ground and would not stop. It became a lake, and the lake was Yellowstone Lake. And the water kept coming, running out of the lake, and it ran in two directions. One stream ran south and became the Snake River. Another stream ran north and became the Yellowstone River. Coyote, panicked, tried to stop the flow. He threw rocks in front of the water. The rocks piled up, but the water rushed over them, and where the rocks piled up, the water became waterfalls. One pile became the upper falls of the Yellowstone. Another pile became the lower falls. And another pile, farther south, became the great cataract now called Shoshone Falls, on the Snake River in what is now Idaho. That is a documented Shoshone tradition. It is not a legend I have made up to fit the video. It has a source, it has a lineage, it has been kept in a specific family. And if you go to the Fort Hall Reservation today and you ask the elders about the origin of the Snake and the Yellowstone rivers, some of them still know how the story goes. And here is what I want you to notice about the story. It explains, precisely, the drainage geography of Yellowstone. It explains why the Yellowstone River flows north and the Snake flows south from the same high ground. It explains why there are waterfalls where the rivers cross the same kind of hard rock. It is a cosmology, yes, But it is also a map. The Shoshone were mapping the country. They just weren't drawing it on paper. I want to slow down here, because there is something I need to say about what oral tradition is and what it is not, and how easy it has been for outsiders to get it wrong. Oral tradition is not superstition. It is not the primitive precursor to science, replaced when white people arrived with their sextants and their journals. Oral tradition is a technology for storing information over long spans of time. In a culture without writing, if you want a piece of knowledge to survive across generations, you attach it to a story. You give the knowledge a character. You give it a plot. You give it a rhythm that lodges in the ear and refuses to leave. When a Shoshone elder told a child the story of Coyote in the fish basket, that child learned, without knowing it, that the rivers drained in two directions, that waterfalls occurred at specific places, that the lake was the source. And when that child grew up and needed, for practical reasons, to know how to travel from Yellowstone Lake to the Snake River country, the story had already given them the map. This is how it worked. This is how it always worked. And in the specific case of the Shoshone at Yellowstone, this is what kept a body of geographical, hydrological, and geological knowledge intact across, on the low estimate, 300 human generations. 300 generations of noticing where the ground was hot. 300 generations of noticing where the sheep went to lick the salt. 300 generations of noticing which springs healed and which ones killed. There is another piece of Shoshone cosmology I need to mention, because it has been badly used by outsiders, and I want to give it back to the people who made it. The Shoshone, along with their Paiute and Washoe and Bannock relatives across the Great Basin, tell of beings called water babies. In the Shoshone language, they are sometimes called Pa'oha. In the Western Shoshone dialect, they are also called Nunumbi. Depending on the band, they are described as small, human-like beings, sometimes with fish tails, sometimes fully human in shape, who live in the springs and the lakes and the deep pools of the rivers. The elders will tell you, if you ask them respectfully, that the cry of a water baby, a sound like a human infant weeping heard in a place where no infant could be, is not a thing to seek out. You do not go to it. You do not answer it. You leave it alone. Popular accounts, most of them written by white authors in the 20th century, turn this into a horror movie. Sirens, monsters, vengeful spirits who drag children to their deaths. And to be fair, some Shoshone bands do teach a version of the water babies as beings not to be trifled with, beings that punish those who harm children or foul the waters. Everything I have said here is in the record. It is not invention. But what I want you to notice is what a Shoshone hunter at Yellowstone would have understood the water babies to mean in practice. They are, functionally, a warning system. They are the reason a child is told, from the age of speaking, not to wander alone to the edges of the deep pools. They are the reason certain springs are approached only in certain ways, and only by certain people. They are, if you look at them plainly, a set of ancient rules for how to live safely around water that can boil, water that can drown, water that can dissolve you if you fall into the wrong place. They are a code, an oral technology, wrapped in the shape of a spirit. You can call that superstition if you want. But if you had lived at Yellowstone for 11,000 years and you needed a way to make sure your grandchildren did not fall into the boiling springs, you would probably do exactly what the Shoshone did. You would tell them a story that stayed with them. You would put a face on the water. You would give the water a voice. And you would know, and your grandchildren would know, and their grandchildren after them, that when the ground here breathes, it has to be respected. Not feared, respected. There is a difference, and the difference matters, and it is exactly the difference that Anglo-American observers were about to fail to notice. And then, in the space of a single decade, all of that was declared not to exist. That is Act 2. And Act 2 is where the record fails us, sometimes on purpose. In the summer of 1805, an expedition led by Meriwether Lewis and William Clark reached the headwaters of the Missouri River. Clark did not himself enter what would become Yellowstone. He never did. But he sat down with a group of native men, probably Nez Perce or Hidatsa, and he asked them what lay to the south, in the country of the Yellowstone River's headwaters. And one of them, or perhaps several of them, told him something. Clark wrote it down in his journal. Here is what he wrote, more or less. At the head of this river, the natives give an account that there is frequently heard a loud noise like thunder, which makes the earth tremble. They state that they seldom go there because their children cannot sleep, and conceive it possessed of spirits who are averse that men should be near them. That is the first written mention of Yellowstone in the English language. A hearsay report, gotten from native informants Clark himself did not name, describing a place none of them had led him to. And it plants a seed, a single sentence about spirits who do not want men near them. A single sentence about children who cannot sleep. Read it back, honestly. That is a hunter's practical explanation for why he does not camp in a place where a geyser might scald his family in the night. It is not a religious taboo. It is not superstition. It is the same reason you do not pitch your tent under an unstable rock face. But it entered the record as fear, and it stayed in the record as fear. For the next 100 years, Every white man who wrote about native people in Yellowstone would come back to those two lines. The Indians were afraid of the geysers. The Indians did not go there. The Indians thought it was haunted. None of that was true. But it made a very useful story. The second white man to see Yellowstone, or something close to it, was John Colter. Colter had walked away from the Lewis and Clark expedition in the fall of 1806, turned around at the mouth of the Yellowstone River, and hired on with a trader named Manuel Lisa. In the winter of 1807, Lisa sent him alone, on foot, with a 30-pound pack, into country no European or American had ever seen, to make contact with the Crow and Shoshone, and try to bring them to the trading post at the mouth of the Bighorn. Colter walked, by the best estimate, some 500 miles that winter. He crossed the Absaroka Range through Sunlight Basin. He came out at what is now the Shoshone River, west of Cody, Wyoming. He saw hot springs there, springs that stank of sulfur so badly he called the river the Stinking Water. Then he went farther over Togwotee Pass, or something like it, and into the country that is now Yellowstone National Park. He may have walked the western shore of Yellowstone Lake. He may have seen the geyser basins. He came out alive. And when he came back and told the men at the fort what he had seen, boiling mud and spouting water and colored pools and steam rising out of the ground, they laughed at him. For years afterward, when a trapper wanted to describe an unbelievable place, he would call it Colter's Hell. It was a joke. The joke stuck. It would still be stuck 150 years later, when it entered the tourist literature as if it were sober fact. Notice something. Colter did not have a name for the geyser country because he needed one. The Shoshone had had names for it for 1,000 years. Colter's name was the name Anglo-American culture would remember. That is not because Colter's name was truer. That is because Colter's culture wrote things down. By the 1820s and 30s, more mountain men were coming into the country. Jim Bridger, who probably first saw Yellowstone around 1824, made a career out of storytelling. Bridger had a Shoshone wife. In fact, he had 2 Shoshone wives over his lifetime, and he knew the country as well as any white man alive. He also knew that his stories about the geysers were being laughed at, so he leaned into it. He told his listeners that Yellowstone had a petrified forest full of petrified birds singing petrified songs. He told them there was a mountain of pure glass through which an elk could be seen as if a foot away, when in truth it was miles distant. He told them of a river that ran so fast the friction made it boil. Some of what Bridger said was a knowing lie. Some of it was a fairly accurate description that got laughed at anyway. The petrified forest was real, or real enough. The glass mountain was obsidian cliff. The hot river was the fire hole. The problem is that after Bridger, no one could tell where the truth ended and the campfire yarn began. And when the first federal expeditions finally came in 1870 and 1871, they came with a mission to sort fact from fable, to rescue Yellowstone from the mountain men's imagination. They did not come to ask the Shoshone what the Shoshone knew. The Washburn-Langford-Doane expedition arrived in 1870. The Hayden Geological Survey arrived in 1871. Hayden brought a photographer named William Henry Jackson and a painter named Thomas Moran. Between them, they produced images that had never before existed in the world. Pictures of Old Faithful erupting, pictures of the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone, the long stripe of yellow rock the river had cut through the plateau. Paintings, in Moran's case, so vast and so strange that when they were shown in Washington in the winter of 1871, they helped convince a Congress that had never seen the place to make it in March of 1872, the first national park in the history of the world. President Ulysses S. Grant signed the Yellowstone Park Act on the 1st of March, 1872. It set aside 2.2 million acres of the highest, wildest country in the American West as a public pleasure ground, in the language of the Act, for the benefit and enjoyment of the people. The people, of course, meant a very specific people. The Shoshone are not mentioned in the Yellowstone Park Act. The Bannock are not mentioned. The Crow, the Blackfeet, the Nez Perce, the Kiowa, the Flathead, none of them are mentioned. The Tukadika, who were at that moment still living within the boundaries of the newly declared park, are not mentioned. It is as if they were not there, but they were there. There is no serious doubt about that anymore. The photographs from that same era show it. William Henry Jackson himself, the photographer who made Yellowstone famous, took a picture at Medicine Lodge Creek in Idaho in 1871, showing a group of Tukadika, men, women, and children in front of their wickiup. That photograph exists. You can look at it. You can look at those faces. Those are the people the park was declared to have been empty of. Something happens next that is very important to understand, and it happens quickly. In the summer of 1877, a band of about 750 Nez Perce fleeing the U.S. Army, after a series of confrontations in Idaho, crossed the newly established Yellowstone National Park. They were not lost. They were not wandering. They knew the country. They were following, roughly, the old Bannock Trail, a route their peoples and the peoples of their allies had known for thousands of years, running from Camas Meadows in Idaho, over Targhee Pass, down along the Madison, over the Gallatin Range, past Mammoth Hot Springs, and out through the Lamar Valley into the Bighorn Basin. Read what I just said. In 1877, 5 years after the park was created and declared uninhabited by Indians, a band of 750 Nez Perce crossed it in the summer without a map, on a trail their ancestors had cut. They did it because their grandparents had done it. They did it because everyone in that country, on all sides of the Continental Divide, knew that trail. They passed through the geyser basins. They encountered a small party of tourists near Mary Mountain. 2 of those tourists were killed. Several more were wounded. This was, by any account, a tragedy. It was also, in the context of a people running for their lives from an army that was trying to kill them, a fairly small event. But the story reached Washington, and it panicked the young park administration in a way that the Nez Perce leaders could not possibly have anticipated. Because from the point of view of the men trying to sell Yellowstone as America's wonderland, the country's premier vacation destination for the well-heeled traveler, the presence of any Indians at all inside the park was a marketing catastrophe. The country needed to look empty. The Nez Perce had crossed a park that was supposed to be empty, and they had, in doing so, cost the government a great deal of ink. The next summer, in 1878, a party of Bannock, fleeing their own conflict on the Snake River Plain, crossed the park in the same way, along the same trail. There was a smaller confrontation east of the park boundary. The Bannock were routed. Their leaders were captured. The story reached Washington again. And the pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Indian peoples were still using an ancient road that ran through the middle of the newly declared national park because it was their road, because it had been their road for a very long time, and because they had nowhere else to go. Superintendent Norris responded in 1878 by ordering the cutting of a new military road from Mammoth Hot Springs south to the Upper Geyser Basin. The stated purpose was to allow soldiers to intercept any future Indian crossings. The unstated purpose was to overwrite the Bannock Trail with an Anglo-American road in the same country on almost the same route, but named differently, marked differently, and used differently. It is possible today to drive over long stretches of the Bannock Trail without knowing you are driving over anything. The trail is still there under the asphalt. The name is not. And then, in the winter of 1879, 5 Chinese miners were killed at a place called Loon Creek in the mountains of central Idaho. There was no evidence identifying who did it. Some later accounts suggested it was probably the work of Anglo-American miners themselves, disguised as Indians. Some other accounts pointed the finger at renegade Bannock and Shoshone, left over from the war of the previous year. The one group of people who almost certainly had nothing to do with the murders was a small band of Tukadika living in the Salmon River country. But the Tukadika were blamed, and the United States Army, under General Oliver Howard, launched a campaign against them. It became known as the Sheep Eater War. It lasted about 4 months. When it was over, in October of 1879, 51 Tukadika, most of them women and children, had been captured. They were marched out of their mountains. They were placed on the Fort Hall Reservation in Idaho, or, in the case of the Wyoming Tukadika, sent to the Wind River Reservation. The band that had lived in the highest country of Yellowstone for something between 1,500 and 11,000 years, depending on how you count, was, from the point of view of the United States government, no longer there. There is a detail about Loon Creek that I want to sit with for a moment because it captures something about how the story worked. 5 Chinese miners were killed there in February of 1879. The murders were violent. The bodies were mutilated. The people who found them said the killers had left signs that were meant to look like Indian signs, arrows placed a certain way, marks scratched into the timbers. Anglo-Americans in the region were quick to blame the local Tukadika because Tukadika made a convenient enemy, and because 5 dead Chinese miners were, in the racial calculus of the 1870s in Idaho Territory, a useful pretext for a war that some people had wanted for other reasons. But the marks did not, on closer examination, look right. The arrows were placed the way a white man imagined an Indian would place them, not the way any actual Indian in that country would have. Several later investigators, including some who wrote about the affair well into the 20th century, concluded that the killings had almost certainly been the work of Anglo-American miners, dressed up to look like an Indian attack in order to steal from the dead and provoke a military campaign that would drive the Tukadika out of the mountains and open the country to further prospecting. The evidence for this is circumstantial. It is also strong, and it means that the war that removed the last free-living Shoshone band from the mountains of central Idaho and northwestern Wyoming may have been triggered by a false flag operation. That is the phrase we use now. In 1879, they had other phrases for it, or none at all, because no one in a position of power was asking the question. 51 Tukadika, mostly women and children, paid the price. And this is where a man named Philetus W. Norris walks into the story. Norris was the second superintendent of Yellowstone National Park. He took the position in 1877 and held it until 1882. He was a self-mythologizing sort of man, the kind who wore fringed buckskin for formal portraits. He was a promoter. He wanted tourists to come to the park. And tourists, in the aftermath of the Nez Perce crossing and the Bannock skirmish, were skittish. Norris solved the problem with words. In the fall of 1879, hunting alone on the backside of Bunsen Peak in the northern part of the park, Norris stumbled into a canyon and found something that surprised him. Firebrands, decaying lodgepoles, a camp that had been used, in his own written words, within the year, maybe within the month. 6 miles from his headquarters at Mammoth Hot Springs, there had been Tukadika living, not centuries ago, now, or last month at any rate. For more than 2 years, he had been telling anyone who would listen that no Indians inhabited Yellowstone. Norris did not correct himself. He doubled down. In his annual report of 1880, sent to the Secretary of the Interior in Washington, he wrote a sentence that would echo through the next century of Yellowstone interpretation. Owing to the isolation of the park, deep amid snowy mountains and the superstitious awe of the roaring cataracts, sulfur pools, and spouting geysers over the surrounding pagan Indians, they seldom visit it. Only a few sheep-eater hermits, armed with bows and arrows, ever resided there, and even they are now vanished. Read that carefully. Every word of it is doing work. Superstitious awe. That erases 11,000 years of practical knowledge. Pagan Indians. That racializes and religionizes the story. They seldom visit it. That is a claim that contradicts the Bannock Trail, the Obsidian Trade, and Norris's own discovery on Bunsen Peak. A few sheep-eater hermits. That reduces an entire band to a handful of oddballs. And even they are now vanished. That takes up people who had just been forcibly removed and rewrites the removal into a mystical disappearance. That single paragraph is one of the most consequential lies in the history of American public land management. Not because Norris was inventing everything from scratch. He was drawing on the Lewis and Clark Seed from 1805. He was drawing on stray letters from Jesuit missionaries in the 1850s. He was drawing on the atmosphere of the age, which wanted Indians to be a vanished people. But he was giving that atmosphere the official voice of the United States government in the official record of the first national park. And once it was in the record, it became true. If you have been watching for 8 or 10 minutes and you find yourself getting angry or getting sad or wanting to know how much of what you were taught about the American West is like this, hold that feeling. There is more, and the third act is where the story turns from erasure to invention. But first, if any of this matters to you, if you have felt yourself learning something you were never told, consider hitting the subscribe button now. We do not do this story anywhere else. And the work of pulling it out of the archives and putting it back on the record is slow, and the algorithm does not favor slow. Your subscription helps. Back to the ground. In the 1880s, Yellowstone entered its promotional phase. The Northern Pacific Railroad had reached the park's northern boundary in 1883. Grand hotels were being built. The park was being sold to a national and international audience as America's Wonderland, a phrase that appeared on posters and pamphlets by the thousands. And the story that America's Wonderland was telling about itself needed an origin. It needed a mystique. It needed the kind of romance that a place with fresh paint and railroad ties could not provide on its own. So the promoters reached back for Indians. Not real Indians. The real ones had been removed, or in the case of the eastern Shoshone under Chief Washakie, restricted to the Wind River Reservation 150 miles to the south, where they still are today. The kind of Indian the Yellowstone promoters needed was the vanished kind, the mystical kind, the kind who had feared the geysers and left so that white tourists could enjoy them in safety and with a shiver of borrowed atmosphere. Place names came first. The naming of Yellowstone in English is a document all by itself. Devil's Slide, north of Mammoth, Hellbroth Springs, Brimstone Basin, Devil's Frying Pan, Devil's Kitchen, Devil's Thumb, Devil's Cauldron, the Devil's Well. The historian Peter Nabokov, in his book Restoring a Presence, published in 2004, counted more than 50 diabolic toponyms once in official use in the park. Every one of them was placed by Anglo-Americans. Every one of them projected a Christian cosmology of hell and damnation onto features that the Shoshone and their neighbors had known by completely different names for 1,000 years. Ask yourself, honestly, what happens to a place when you name it after the devil? You make it foreign. You make it exotic. You put a frame around it that says, this is a place of dark magic. Encounter it accordingly. And you invite the visitor to imagine that the previous inhabitants must have shared your dread of it, because who could not dread the devil's kitchen? The problem, of course, is that the previous inhabitants had not felt any such dread. They had felt, we can say from the sources, respect and practical care. Some of the springs were sacred. Some of the springs were used for healing. Some of the springs were used to soften horn for a bow. None of them were the devil's anything. But the devil sold tickets. The next layer of invention came with the books, and this is where the story becomes almost surreal, in a small way, when you learn how it worked. In 1913, a dentist from Billings, Montana, named W.F. Allen, published a book he called The Sheep Eaters. Allen claimed to have located a 115-year-old sheep eater woman living among the Crow, and to have communicated with her over some length of time in sign language. From this conversation, which no one else witnessed and about which no notes have survived, he generated an entire fake ethnography of the Tukadika. He described them as pygmies. He described them as timid. He described them as impoverished degenerates without guns or horses. He filled his pages with legends and beliefs that he had effectively made up. Later anthropologists, including Ake Holtkrantz, who himself spent years working with the Shoshone at Wind River, would eventually conclude that Allen's book was almost entirely fabricated. But by then, it had been in circulation for decades. It had shaped the way generations of tourists thought about the people who had lived in Yellowstone. It had made them small. It had made them helpless. It had made them, above all, invisible in advance, so that when the tourist stood on the boardwalk at Old Faithful and looked out over the geyser basin, he did not feel, and could not feel, that he was standing in someone else's homeland. And then there was Trapper Jim. Trapper Jim's Fables of Sheep-Eater Indians in Yellowstone was, for much of the early 20th century, the only book about native people that was sold in the Yellowstone Park gift shops. Its contents were, in the words of one modern reviewer, entirely fictional. Every legend in it was invented. Every custom in it was invented. Every proper noun in it was invented. It presented Anglo-American campfire yarns dressed up as ancient Shoshone belief, and it sold them to visitors who had every reason to think they were learning something true. Take a moment with that fact. For most of the 20th century, the official Indian story of the world's first national park, sold at the counter of its official gift shops, was a book of pure invention. If you visit a national park today and you buy a book, you assume, reasonably, that a curator somewhere has vetted the thing, that someone with a scholarly reputation stands behind it, that the story you are taking home is at least trying to be true. That assumption is younger than you think it is, and for most of the 20th century in Yellowstone, it did not hold. There is a Jesuit priest I have not mentioned yet, and he deserves a moment because his letter did quiet, patient damage. His name was Père Pierre Jean de Smet. He was Belgian by birth, a Catholic missionary by vocation, and he spent decades among the native peoples of the Northern Plains and the Rockies. He was, by the standards of his time, sympathetic. He learned languages. He wrote seriously. He was later one of the go-between figures in some of the treaty negotiations of the 1860s. In 1852, in a letter meant for European audiences, de Smet wrote a description of the Yellowstone country that he had never personally visited. He wrote that the Indians of the region considered the place, in his phrasing, a kind of hell. That single phrase, a kind of hell, was picked up by later writers and repeated. De Smet had no way of knowing whether this was true. His informants, if he had informants, were probably French-speaking traders passing on a joke they had picked up from someone else. But the phrase had the authority of a priest, and it had the authority of a foreign witness, and it slotted neatly into a growing European fantasy of the American West as a landscape of biblical menace. Then, in 1883, a traveler named Hamilcar Hollister took a trip through the newly established park. He would later publish an account of it in 1912 at the end of his life, and in that account, he claimed that a native guide had told him that white people should not be allowed in Yellowstone because they would fall in league with the devils that lived under the ground and end up destroying all the tribes. Whether Hollister's guide actually said any such thing, or whether Hollister invented the exchange later, or whether the guide was pulling his leg, no one can now say. What matters is that Hollister's memoir was published and it was read, and it added yet another sedimentary layer to the story of Indian dread of the geysers. And here is the strangest layer of all. When serious anthropologists finally started studying the Shoshone at Yellowstone in the 20th century, some of them repeated the myth themselves. Ake Holtkrantz, the Swedish scholar who spent more time with the Wind River Shoshone than almost any other outside observer, and who deserves great respect for his lifetime of careful ethnographic work, nevertheless wrote in some of his publications that the Shoshone had been afraid of the Yellowstone geysers. He was drawing, apparently, on the same body of Anglo-American secondary sources that everyone else had drawn on. He was drawing on Norris. He was drawing on de Smet. He was drawing on Doc Allen. And he passed the myth forward, dressed in the authority of academic anthropology, to another generation. That is how a lie becomes durable. Not through one person telling it, through many people repeating it, each of them citing the last one, until the trail of citation loops back on itself and no one remembers the point at which anyone was ever actually there, listening to a real Shoshone person say something. The invention did not stop at books. It moved into interpretation. Park rangers, well-meaning, mostly Anglo, told visitors the geyser fear story for generations. School textbooks repeated it. Encyclopedias repeated it. The Encyclopedia Britannica, at various points in the 20th century, told its readers that the native peoples of the region had avoided Yellowstone because they thought the springs were haunted. That claim, honestly, is still floating around in the tourist literature today. If you go to a certain kind of website about the park in 2026, you will still find it. And the strangest thing about all this, the thing I keep coming back to, is that the invention was not necessary. The real Shoshone story is stranger and more interesting than the invented one. The Tukadika did soften Bighorn Horn in the hot springs. They did quarry the same cliff for 11,000 years. They did have a coyote story that mapped, with startling geographic accuracy, the drainage of two of the largest river systems in the American West. They did know what was underneath. They did not fear it. But an accurate Shoshone story could not be turned into a folk pageant. It could not be reduced to a printed line on a postcard. It required knowing the difference between the Tukadika and the Agaidika and the Kukundika. It required using the word Numic. It required admitting that the people were still, at that moment, 150 miles down the road at Wind River, alive, angry, and available for comment. And that was harder to sell than a legend of a lost tribe that feared the smoke. So the legend won. For about 130 years it won. It did not, in the end, win forever. And this is the last turn of the story and the one that is still going on. In 1994, the National Park Service commissioned Peter Nabokov, a cultural anthropologist at UCLA, and Lawrence Lohndorf, an archaeologist at New Mexico State, to conduct a comprehensive study of Indian peoples in Yellowstone. The study took a decade. The book that came out of it, Restoring a Presence, was published by the University of Oklahoma Press in 2004. It ran 381 pages. It drew on tribal archives, on oral histories collected from living Shoshone and Bannock and Crow elders, on the archaeological record, and on a rereading of nearly every early European account of the region. Its central claim was simple, and it was devastating to the previous story. American Indians had not avoided Yellowstone. They had lived in it, hunted in it, quarried it, healed in it, married in it, buried their dead in it, told stories about it, and passed knowledge of it down for something in the range of 11,000 years. The myth of Indian fear of the geysers was, in Nabokov and Lohndorf's careful language, an administrative convenience. It had served the Park Service. It had served the tourism industry. It had never had a factual basis. Around the same time, and continuing since, the National Park Service began to change its interpretation. Signs were rewritten. Programs were added. In 2022, on the park's 150th anniversary, the Shoshone Bannock tribes of Fort Hall and the National Park Service jointly dedicated new interpretive panels at Coulter Bay and Grand Teton, giving the Bannock and Shoshone names for the country back to the country. Panakwate Taviwa, Bannock Country. Numiowinda, meaning, roughly, we are always moving from place to place. An executive order now allows enrolled members of federally recognized tribes to gather certain plants and roots inside Yellowstone. It is not everything the tribes might want. It is not the country back. It is, however, a small piece of the door standing open where before there had been a wall, and the eastern Shoshone are still at Wind River, 150 miles south of the geyser basins. They run their own government. They run their own schools. They speak their own language. In 2016, after an absence of 131 years, they brought bison back to the reservation. 10 head at first, then more. They are working quietly, patiently, at what one Shoshone bison manager described as, in his words, remembering how to be a people with the buffalo again. The Shoshone Bannock tribes at Fort Hall have their own cultural preservation department. They have their own linguists working to keep the Numic language alive in children. When they refer to Yellowstone in their own language, they do not use the word Yellowstone. They use their own words. They have never stopped using their own words. They are, in short, still there. And the story of what is beneath Yellowstone, the actual story, the one they were telling before Coulter, before Lewis and Clark, before Norris, before Trapper Jim, is still available. It is not gone. It was never gone. It was only, for a long stretch of time, drowned out by louder people telling worse stories. Let me close where we began. Let me close beside a hot spring at dawn. There is a man standing at the edge of a pool. His breath is visible in the cold air. The steam is rising off the water in front of him, thick, sulphurous, alive. He is Tukudika. His people have been coming to this place for as long as any of them can remember, and as long as their oldest stories go back, and longer than that. He is not afraid. He knows that under his feet the earth is molten. He does not have the word magma. He has other words. He knows that the fire beneath the ground is what feeds the water, and the water is what softens the sheephorn. And the sheephorn is what makes the bow, and the bow is what feeds his family. He knows that below the pool at his feet there is a chamber, or a river, or a spirit, or something older than the word for anything. And it is the source of the heat that gave him his life. He would not put it that way, because that is my language, not his. But he knows. He knows what is beneath Yellowstone. 99 years from where he stands, a man named Norris will sit down in a cabin at Mammoth Hot Springs and write a sentence that will erase this man from the record for the next 100 years. And 144 years from where he stands, a book will be published that will start putting him back. The steam keeps rising. He does not know any of this yet. He does not need to know it. He is a hunter on a winter morning, at the edge of a spring where his people have always stood. He waits. He listens to the ground. Somewhere beneath him, the volcano breathes. And what is beneath Yellowstone is not, in the end, only the caldera, though the caldera is there and the magma is there and the plates are grinding out the same slow music they have been grinding out for 630,000 years. What is beneath Yellowstone is also the record of the people who lived on it, who named it, who walked its trails, who quarried its glass, who softened their bowstrings in its waters, and who were then written out of the history by men who needed the country to appear to have been empty. They were not empty of it. They are still not empty of it. They are, at this moment, at Wind River, at Fort Hall, at Duck Valley, at Elko, going about their days in their own language, in the country that was never as empty as they were told it was. And the man at the edge of the pool, on that winter morning, looking down into the water where his sheep horns soaked before they became bows, was doing something no European would understand for another 200 years. He was listening to what was under the ground. He always had. He had never stopped. He knew what was beneath Yellowstone, and now, if you have stayed with me for the hour it took to say this, you know it too.